Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lights, putting the phone face down for once, and floating back into a corner of history that's equal parts unsettling and, well, oddly cozy. We're talking about people who thought the best possible holy object was someone's freshly removed head. Yes, cults and communities that built their entire identity around decapitated skulls, like that's just a normal weekend ritual. Now, before you think this is going to be some gore-filled thriller, relax. This is the quiet, sleepy version. We're not here for battlefields or blood-soaked screams. We're here for the aftermath. The quiet candlelit shrines where an important head was polished, decorated, and whispered to, like the world's most impractical houseplant. The fascination with heads goes way back. Across ancient Europe, particularly among the Celts, the human head wasn't just a body part. It was the body part. The Celts believed the head was the seat of the soul. The heart? Nah. The stomach? Absolutely not. It was all about the head. This meant that if you could, say, chop off your enemies, you weren't just showing off your sword skills, you were collecting a literal container of power. Archaeologists have found shrines in Gaul and Britain filled with niches carved into the walls. And guess what sat there? Human skulls, just lined up like the creepiest pottery collection you've ever seen. Some were even nailed to doorways, like a weirdly aggressive welcome sign. This is my house, and also Brian's head. Of course, the Romans, who loved to make fun of everyone else while also secretly borrowing half their culture, were appalled. Roman writers described the Celts as these wild, barbaric people who decorated their homes with skulls, which is true. But then again, the Romans also threw people to lions for weekend fun, so maybe they shouldn't talk. Let's drift a little further east, because head cults weren't just a Celtic thing. In ancient India, certain tantric sects considered the human skull a sacred vessel, perfect for ritual. Not only did they keep them, they also carved them into bowls. Imagine sipping your herbal tea out of one of those while telling your followers, it's for spiritual enlightenment. Of course it is. And then there are the saints. Christian Europe couldn't resist the head obsession either. You'd think a religion centered on resurrection and the body might cool it with the decapitations, but no. By the Middle Ages, having the head of a saint was basically the holy grail of relics. Monasteries competed over who had the real skull of John the Baptist. Spoiler, there were at least 4 different ones being venerated at the same time. Apparently, he had a very detachable head. Pilgrims would flock to see these relics, kneeling before cases containing someone's mummified skull. It wasn't just faith, it was also good for tourism. A monastery with a celebrity head got a lot more donations. If you've ever wondered how medieval churches paid for all those fancy stained glass windows, let's just say a famous cranium did wonders for the budget. And yet, people didn't even agree on what to do with these heads. Some wrapped them in velvet. Others dunked them in silver casings, like the most gothic Faberge egg. A few left them bare so the pilgrims could really get the full-bone experience. Nothing like praying to the eye sockets of a long-dead martyr to start your morning right. But here's where it gets more surreal. In Ireland, there were local cults devoted to heads that weren't even saints. Just warriors, chiefs, or sometimes complete unknowns. There's this recurring idea that a head, once separated, held enough power to keep protecting or haunting a community. People would bury them under doorsteps, plant them near wells, or carry them into battle, like a macabre lucky charm. Forget rabbit's feet. This was much more direct. Sounds bizarre, but to them it was comforting. A head wasn't just death, it was presence. It was like keeping someone close only in the most literal way possible. And if you're thinking this was all a distant ancient thing, well, not quite. Head relics quietly survived right into the early modern world. Even Renaissance rulers, supposedly all about humanism and classical beauty, were still hoarding skulls of saints in their treasuries. Sometimes they'd even show them off during feasts like, and here's dessert. Oh, and also St. Catherine's head, because why not double down? Let's just pause here, settle deeper into the pillow, and admit that humans are weird. Out of all the things to worship, we picked the most fragile, breakable part of the body, one that doesn't even stay nice for very long. But for thousands of years, across cultures and continents, heads were not just symbols of death. They were sacred, powerful, even protective. And that, I think, is the strange comfort. To them, a decapitated head wasn't the end of a story. It was a beginning. So we've settled into the Celtic shrines, the Indian skull bowls, and the monastic scramble for saintly craniums. Let's wander further because, as it turns out, almost no culture could resist the urge to put a head on a pedestal. Literally. Take medieval France, for example. Entire towns claimed the privilege of guarding holy heads. The skull of Saint Denis, the patron saint of Paris, was one of the big-ticket relics. According to legend, after he was decapitated, Denis simply picked up his own head, tucked it under his arm, and calmly walked several miles before collapsing. Which, honestly, is quite the commute. Pilgrims adored this story. It confirmed that heads weren't just powerful when sitting still. They could apparently go for a brisk jog if necessary. Of course, the cathedral that ended up with Denis's relics made a fortune. Pilgrims came pouring in, dropping coins in the donation box, eager for a glimpse of the head that once walked itself home. And meanwhile, other towns quietly claimed their version of the same relic. Because in the Middle Ages, everyone had their own authentic head of a saint. It was like collecting Funko Pops, only with skulls. The competition for relics got so intense that kings joined in. In England, Henry V supposedly carried a saint's head into battle for luck, because nothing says divine blessing like swinging a mace in one hand and balancing a skull in the other. Even emperors wanted their share. Charlemagne's treasury, according to chroniclers, contained several skulls of saints. He was basically running the medieval equivalent of a very creepy museum. Now, if we drift into Eastern Europe, the obsession takes a slightly different turn. Among Slavic peoples, legends spoke of talking heads, severed heads of wise men or prophets that could keep giving advice long after their bodies were gone. Imagine that, a floating oracle minus the body. It's easy to laugh at, but if you were living in the 10th century, desperately hoping for good harvests, maybe a chatty skull didn't seem so strange. And then, there were the royals who couldn't let go of their enemies. Literally. In Hungary, King Bela IV kept the skull of his rival polished and displayed, like a trophy. He wasn't even subtle about it. Some chronicles suggest he turned it into a drinking cup, because if you're going to humiliate your foes, you might as well sip wine from their forehead. That trend wasn't unique to him. Other rulers from Central Asia to Scandinavia did the same. It's almost like the ultimate medieval insult was, "Nice to see you again in goblet form." But here's where the story turns strangely soft. Some head cults weren't about enemies at all. They were about memory. In Ireland, entire communities would protect the skulls of local heroes, washing them carefully, wrapping them in cloth, and passing them down through generations. To them, the head wasn't grotesque. It was family, a sort of relic of belonging. You didn't just remember great-grandfather. You dusted him off once a week. Even the church struggled with this. Priests often scolded people for clinging to pagan skull veneration. But then, of course, the same priests were happily parading saintly heads around their own altars. Hypocrisy has always been humanity's strong suit. And if we peek at the Renaissance, supposedly the age of reason, you'd expect this habit to fade. But no. Wealthy collectors loved keeping curiosities in their cabinets. A mummified head, nicely mounted, sat right next to seashells, fossils, and ancient coins. Because nothing says refined taste like having a stranger's face staring at you while you study your books. Let's settle for a moment here. You can almost imagine it. Flickering candlelight in some drafty hall, a jeweled reliquary on a shelf, the faint outline of a skull peeking through a silver mask. To us, it seems morbid. To them, it was reassuring. A reminder of power, faith, or family. So, whether it was nailed to a Celtic doorway, carried into a royal treasury, or polished and prayed to in a tiny Irish cottage, the head was more than just a leftover body part. It was identity. It was protection. And, in a way, it was comfort. So, we've wandered from Celtic shrines to saintly skulls, from kings sipping out of rivals' heads to peasants polishing granddads. But like most things in history, the obsession with decapitated heads didn't last forever. Eventually, people decided maybe it was time to move on from having someone's forehead as a centerpiece. By the Enlightenment, scholars were raising their eyebrows, politely of course, at all these head cults. The new intellectual mood preferred anatomy lectures over relic veneration. You were supposed to look at a skull and think about science, not saints. Phrenology became the fashionable replacement. People ran their hands over bumps on skulls to read personalities, which, in a way, was just a more academic excuse to keep staring at heads. Humans really can't help themselves. Meanwhile, the Church, especially after the Reformation, was getting nervous about its overflowing collection of skulls. Protestants had mocked Catholics for hoarding bones like a bizarre flea market, so inventories were trimmed down, relics locked away, or quietly destroyed. Still, some survived. Even today, if you wander into certain old European cathedrals, you'll see jeweled skulls glinting under glass. A faint echo of those centuries when entire pilgrimages were planned just to kneel before them. And yet, the fascination never quite dies out. Anthropologists in the 19th and 20th centuries unearthed skull shrines across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Every time they did, they seemed surprised. But the pattern is the same. Across cultures, across eras, people gave heads a special status. They weren't just leftovers, they were vessels. Maybe that's the quiet truth behind all this. A body feels anonymous, replaceable, but a face, a head, that's where identity lives. You recognize your loved ones by their face, not their shin bone. So when death came, people clung to the part that still felt personal. The head was memory you could touch. It was continuity in a world that was otherwise unpredictable. Of course, sometimes it went too far. We can admit that polishing your enemy's skull and using it as a wine goblet is maybe not the most empathetic coping mechanism. But the impulse behind it, trying to hold on to power or family or faith, was very human. Even if it took a form that today would probably not pass health and safety guidelines. So here we are, centuries later. The cults are gone. The skull shrines mostly collapsed. The jeweled reliquaries gathering dust. But the idea lingers in small ways. We carve skulls on Halloween pumpkins. We decorate them for Dia de los Muertos. We collect them in pirate logos and band posters. The head, even without its cults, never lost its symbolism. It's still the part of us that says, I was here. And with that, maybe it's time to close our eyes. The people who once whispered to skulls have long since gone quiet. Their shrines are ruins, their relics mostly forgotten. But in their own strange, slightly unnerving way, they were trying to do what we all do. Find meaning in endings, and comfort in what remains. So tonight, as you drift off, just remember, somewhere, in some old cathedral or dusty museum, a jeweled skull is still staring back, patient, silent, and oddly serene. Good night.